everyone. This is the third in our series of sessions today for SBIR Advance awardees. And what's coming up now is a discussion by Anne Marie Finley about an FDA regulatory roadmap. Before I introduce Anne Marie, just a few things. We are recording this session, and we'll share it with the companies participating here. We will. And as Anne goes along, feel free to enter questions in the chat box, and we'll also I'll be monitoring that chat box. We'll also allow time for some questions at the end here. And with that, let me give an introduction to Anne Marie. So Anne Marie is an FDA regulatory consultant and healthcare policy strategist. She has more than 20 years of experience in senior management positions at Fortune 500 pharmaceutical and food corporations, U.S. Food and Drug Administration, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and the U.S. Congress. She's an internationally recognized expert on orphan drug and rare disease policy, and she's also a member of Pipeline Angels of Chicago. So with that introduction, go ahead and take it away, Anne.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I'm happy to be here today. I thought we should discuss considerations and a few lessons I've learned working with startup companies that may be useful as you establish your FDA regulatory roadmap. Just a little bit about me. I have two companies and a consulting firm called Biotech Policy Group that provides advice like this. And I also have a startup of my own, Lipidgenics, which was formed last year. I'm a former executive at Celgene, GE Healthcare, and Amersham Health, and my government experiences include service at FDA in the Office of the Commissioner, as a consultant to the Biomedical Research and Development Administration at HHS, and as a member of the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Blood Safety and Availability. And I was also the chief investigator for U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Government Reform and Oversight, the HHS and FDA accounts. So I'm happy to join you today to discuss defining regulatory affairs as it relates to your product, how absent or inadequate regulatory planning can adversely affect a company and product development. And I have a few horror stories I can share with you. Performing an initial assessment of the regulatory needs and opportunities at your company, how regulatory planning avoids missteps and facilitates faster approval, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. I think we should talk about how one establishes an effective regulatory strategy and the most common mistakes I've seen companies make here in Wisconsin. First of all, there is a question as to whether your company is regulated, and if so, how it is regulated. There's a definition I found, I'm not sure I would quite word it this way, but that a product is considered regulated if a government authority determines when and how the product is allowed to be commercialized. I think I would say from an FDA perspective, we would say how the product is allowed to be marketed, because that's the authority, and I'll show you how that's achieved. Basically, the Food and Drug Administration is responsible for regulation of products consisting of over 25 cents of every consumer dollar spent in this country. They protect the public health by assuring safety and effectiveness, quality and security of human and veterinary drugs, vaccines, other biological products like blood and blood products, medical devices, the food supply, about 78% of it, cosmetics, dietary supplements, and products that give off radiation. That includes not only devices such as scanners, medical scanners, but also things like your television set. And their authority derives from the interstate commerce of those products. So the key words for whether a product is FDA regulated is, can you prove its safety and effectiveness, and is it in interstate commerce? And I raised that because, I'm going to go back here, because I've had 3 times recently companies call me that want to manufacture, they usually say it's a psoriasis product, and they want to distribute it and they're a little surprised when I tell them what the requirements will be and that they probably have to do clinical trials because of the claim that they are making on the label. And if they claim that the product affects the structure and function of the body, then they are making a medical claim and they will have to just, prove that in a clinical trial to FDA. If the product is shipped across a state line, between two states, between a state and another country, or between a state and a US territory or possession. So having said that, several people have decided that they just want to manufacture their creams or lotions. They want to sell them at farmers markets. They want to stay in the state of Wisconsin, and they don't want to claim any, they don't want to make any health claims for the products. So it's important to understand exactly why, this is regulated. Because some companies think they want to be in this space and they in fact don't. So the second point I want to make is, what is the indication that the company intends to pursue and why? And this is the labeling for the drug, which, this obviously there are many more pages, but they won't fit on the slide. And it lays out the claims for the product. And one of the big mistakes that I find that companies make at the size that in the SBIR TTR program is selecting the product's indication based on a big market, not on the company needs. And I would say that company experience, if this is your first product, it's a big market, but there's also competition. Whether you would benefit from incentives, and would determine whether you might want to pick a smaller indication, disease indication for that product before you go into a larger market. And using the example I just gave you, I would suggest exploring some orphan drug markets, smaller indications, rather than going in immediately into a market like psoriasis, for example. So using that, let's talk about orphan drugs and rare diseases and the impact that it has in selecting an indication for smaller companies at this point. Essentially, these are very small populations defined under statute as under 200,000 in the US, but there's a big public health impact. Rare diseases have more than 350 million patients worldwide. There are more than 30 million patients in the US. There are over 7,000 identified rare diseases. When I started in this business about 20 years ago, we estimated 3,000 rare diseases. So again, when you really find that there's you find a therapy, you often find that there's a disease and a patient population that's there that you weren't aware of. There are over 600 approved, actually I think that number is up to 770 approved treatments in the US for rare or orphan diseases. 85 to 90% of rare disorders are serious or life-threatening, and 95% of rare disorders do not have even one therapy. History of this in the US, the Orphan Drug Act was passed by Congress in 1983 to facilitate development of therapies for rare diseases, which are defined again as less than 200,000 patients in the US, or if a company is otherwise unable to recoup research and development costs. You find this example was actually used under COVID, where if you were going to make a vaccine, for example, available to the public, it would be considered eligible for designation. And in fact, one of the companies that manufactured a vaccine did receive an early orphan designation for a COVID vaccine. And then there was some public outcry about it, and they backed off. But they were able to get the designation based on that provision of the law. The Office of Orphan Products Development at FDA is established to facilitate sponsor interaction with the agency. In other words, they are in my opinion, the first step for anyone wishing to discuss a rare disease indication with FDA. They also sponsor a clinical trial grants program that's now over $15 million a year. Many people are not aware of that. When they are submitting applications, they think they just can go to, their only option is NIH. I think that's an important thing to be aware of. Currently, FDA has funded over 2,500 applications, received over 25 applications for 700 studies, and 60 products which have received funding under that program have been approved. The big thing to remember about the Orphan Drug Act is it's all about incentives. There are 7 years of market exclusivity for an orphan designated product that's approved by FDA for each rare disease indication. So the first company that receives product approval for a particular drug for a particular disease indication is the only one that can market that for a period of 7 years. So this is very useful for products that have lost their patentability. If there are 2 companies developing the same therapy for the same disease, only the first to market receives exclusivity, and that there have been a few second runner-ups over the years, and that is they are completely excluded from the market during that 7-year period. Originally, the Orphan Product Act was developed for products with expired patents, but it has many other valuable opportunities for companies, particularly small companies and companies that are just trying to commercialize their initial product. There are tax credits for research and development expenses. They used to be 100% deductible. Now they are 50% deductible. And they carry over. So that's very useful for a startup company. There is an exemption from FDA user fees, complete exemption. And the orphan drug designation has been found by companies to serve not only as an early warning system for competitors, which is what it was originally designed for, but it tends to facilitate investor interest. The results from the Orphan Drug Act have been pretty spectacular. From 1967 to 1983, which is the period 20 years more or less before the Orphan Drug Act was passed, only 34 rare disease drugs were approved in the US. And from the period 73 to 83, the pharmaceutical industry brought only 10 rare disease drugs to market. As of December of last year, FDA has approved more than 770 orphan products and 4,000 orphan drug designations. The Orphan Drug Act in particular is can be pointed to as responsible for pediatric oncology and gene therapy research that otherwise would not have happened. So it's been a very important piece of legislation with rather serious and wide-ranging results. For example, all of these companies have been built by orphan drugs: Celgene, BioMarin, Alexion, Genentech. There are many, many more that could be put on this list, but those are all founded as orphan disease companies. The Orphan Drug Act provisions have been adopted in various ways in other countries, most notably the European Union, Australia, and Japan, who have very, very similar but not identical orphan drug acts. Taiwan, China, Korea, Singapore, and Russia have orphan drug provisions that are not necessarily equivalent to those in the US, but it's important if you're launching a drug to be aware of the fact that there are mechanisms by which the research that you've done can also be used to facilitate registration in other countries. I think it's important for companies to think about the key differences in regulatory approval processes between orphan and non-orphans, because those differences are very useful to smaller companies and startup companies. In 2020, 31 of the 53 novel drugs approved by FDA were orphan drugs or drugs for rare diseases. If you look at the numbers in 2019, 2018, 2017, and 2016, you're looking at least 40, if not 50 or more % of those drugs are orphan drugs. So the new molecular entities that FDA is approving, for the vast majority of those drugs were for rare diseases. There are a couple of reasons for that. There are changes in scientific research by companies. They tend to like to go, a lot of the low-hanging fruit scientifically is gone. They're having to do more innovative type research. So they are necessarily moving into more rare disease areas. There's a strong commercial preference for markets without competition. That, for the most part, is directly aligned with the goals of the Orphan Drug Act. And genetic advances in personalized medicine enable a focus on target populations and clinical trials that necessarily result in patient populations under 200,000. So most of the work in those areas is now occurring in populations defined by statute as eligible for orphan drug indications. There are another, I think these particular opportunities that are afforded by the Orphan Drug Act and related legislation benefit companies, particularly small companies, versus pursuing a non-orphan indication. For example, protocol assistance. I had a conversation with a company the other day that was looking at a larger market, not an orphan indication, and for which there was considerable competition, although there were definitely unmet medical needs within there. And I said, you're a small company, they might be 5 people, not even full-time. I think you need the protocol assistance. You can get that for other indications, but you don't get that kind of support or the priority review, which is related to serious conditions and significant improvement in safety and effectiveness over existing therapies. That, by the way, does not have to be exclusively orphan, but it's really hard to find a breakthrough therapy in a crowded market. The review time is also reduced from 10 months to 6 months under priority review. You also have fast track options, which are for unmet medical needs only, either no therapies or substantial benefit over an existing drug, which provides FDA consultation on study design and rolling submissions. And breakthrough therapy designations, where you can demonstrate early clinical evidence of substantial improvement over current therapies. And this designation can be requested as early as the IND level. Accelerated approval is often used for orphans. It permits surrogate endpoints for drugs with long-term, difficult to prove endpoints, such as increased survival and decreased morbidity. You're seeing an increasing amount of oncology work being done with accelerated approval or coming under the accelerated approval designation. Oftentimes with these trials, confirmation is required by a phase 4 post-marketing trial. I see that with a lot of non-orphan indications, so I'm not sure that the phase 4 requirements are that much of a burden on a company that's pursuing a rare disease indication. The other thing that's very noteworthy here, albeit with considerable caution, are the availability of priority review vouchers, which are awarded for approved drugs for rare pediatric diseases, neglected tropical diseases, and medical countermeasures. So things, therapies for anthrax or COVID or something like that would fall under those categories. A priority review voucher allows an expedited review of any product in any indication. FDA has awarded 18 of them since 2009. The company that receives the PRV can keep it or sell it. And they have been sold for up to $350 million. And I am aware of companies that chose disease targets and indications and projects to develop based on eligibility for priority review. Now, having said that, that's a current program. FDA does not like it. the Congress, this particular Congress, may be far more amenable to getting rid of it. And if you think about it, a priority review is given not on the basis of the merits of the indication and trying to rush something to market for patients that may not have any other therapies, but rather because you hold the PRV. So if you want to get to market more quickly as a company with, with competition in the market, it may be worth it to you to pay $300 million to someone and to a company that's holding a PRV, buy it, and then use it in for an indication that is considered less worthy, perhaps where there are other therapies currently in the market. And FDA then has to deploy resources to meet those statutory obligations, and in an area in which they may not have a tremendous amount of expertise or resources. So it's a burden on the agency because they never know when they're going to have to respond to a PRV and in what area. So it's a controversial program. I don't know if it's going to survive the next 10 years, which is the time frame you have to think about something like that. But it is an opportunity that's afforded when you choose certain kinds of indications to pursue before you pursue other broader indications. There are a couple of mistakes I think are worth discussing as we move through this. There's a lot of work that's required on the regulatory aspects, even in phase 2 of SBIRs. You have to be able to articulate some kind of a path, a regulatory path, and show that you have some resources that will, enable you to deliver that as a company. There's trend spotting across therapeutic areas and FDA organizations, interpretation of recent FDA rejections. These are areas where you could do some work to support that SBIR section. Identifying competitors and competitive behavior is important. Being aware of FDA guidances in certain areas, showing that you're knowledgeable about those are important. There are resources such as virtual conferences that FDA will hold as windows into future guidance changes. For example, they issued some regarding NASH, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, that talked about how they wanted to, the evidence that they would need to see as an agency for approval of those therapies, because obviously there are multiple understanding of what exactly demonstrates efficacy to the agency. So they will sometimes use those guidance documents to explain their thinking. And then there are always external factors on regulatory environments, such as HHS programs, White House, and Congress. But that's a lot to keep track of. And when we get to planning regulatory plans, there's plans that you might put into a follow-on phase 2 SBIR application, and others that other plans that you need to inform how you're going to move forward on your study. There are a lot of guidances that need to be read. You need to be fluent in why filings were late, refusal to file or complete response letters were provided by FDA where they say, thanks, but no thanks, we're not going to approve this drug. There are delays in label approvals, which affects the kind of claims you can make. There are unanticipated black box warnings seem to be a fairly frequent problem with a lot of new therapies. That's just a rising tide of an issue. Oftentimes smaller companies fail to interpret FDA meeting comments appropriately and lose a lot of time, or get to a certain point in the process and realize they didn't understand what FDA was saying to them with regard to the standards for efficacy that would be required. You don't want to be in a position as a company of over relying on partners or regulatory contractors in foreign markets as you plan your regulatory guideposts, in other markets. And you also need to be aware that at the very end of this process, if you're going to manufacture a drug or any kind of device or any kind of a product, you really need to be aware that your interactions early on with the FDA provide an early warning system for inspection standards. You can look at a couple of high-profile regulatory misses that might serve as a warning relative to some of the things I just discussed. There was a rejection. I don't want to use specific company names here, but FDA rejected gene therapy for hemophilia last year. And the agency demanded 2 additional years of data to strengthen the case that the benefits are durable. What's interesting here is that the company didn't realize this, even though there had been guidance documents that had been issued that discussed the length of and duration of benefits for gene therapies. So that information was already on their website, but apparently the company didn't see it, didn't recognize it as directly applicable to the work that they were doing. So I think that's good to realize. Another thing I've seen an increasing amount of recently is companies looking at differences in data between various phases of their studies and then relying on one trial more than another to support the endpoint. And that has tripped up at least 3 companies in the last year. There are some companies that have, in this particular case, there were a lot of questions about, I think, how well powered the study was in a very rare disease, and a lot of questions about the efficacy of the initial studies that were done to support the application for the first drug in this indication that the company had. And the second, I think they squeaked through the first time for a variety of reasons, but the second time, I don't think they did, which goes to show you that having the kind of input that you need for clinical trial design from a regulatory agency is a really valuable thing, and something that you should really think about when you are thinking about launching a product. You can launch in generally multiple indications, but choosing one that provides more of these benefits that we've discussed is I think a very worthwhile process to consider. Let's see. I think there are a couple of things we've talked about regarding forward thinking in regulatory affairs. You can look at regulatory trends across review divisions. FDA's information is very much on their website. All of the speeches that their senior leaders have made, the review officers and the Office of New Drugs, all of those things are available online, and you really need to be aware of those as you're moving through. When you come to things like the impact of things like presidential elections, that is more, tends to be focused in the higher profile areas. So oncology, rare diseases, pediatrics, et cetera. There can be waves of change caused by interested parties in other areas of the government that I think are worth keeping in mind. And if you can ride that wave with a new product, that's an important thing to do. I think we can move to just in general, some concluding thoughts. there's no one size fits all for regulatory needs. All of these decisions, and there'll be multiple decisions that need to be made, have to be made with the idea that you're moving towards a desired label and the claims that you want to make on that label. Company size, portfolio, therapeutic focus, all impact functional needs and regulatory product planning. And absent or inadequate planning function not only impacts the operational efficiency, but it increases risk exposure. And you see this all the time, not just with small companies, but also with large companies that frankly have had a lot of regulatory experience and should know better. I think the biggest bit of advice I would say is that building in some kind of a regulatory affairs function, even if you're using, consultants at the time, if you do that at the start, it's the best defense against being stunned or surprised by regulatory authorities and requirements. And that's really needed even at the phase 1, 2 level of these applications. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Actually, I have one. I don't see any in the chat box at the moment, but I have one. And so you mentioned on an earlier slide about when doing an inadequate regulatory plan, you mentioned something about over reliance on partners.
Yeah.
Don't have what do you have a handle on where is the line between over reliance and a good partnership that will be helpful?
Well, I mean, the over-reliance, there's an over-reliance on universities, which are not really in the commercialization business. It's an over-reliance on, what you've seen as the path for perhaps a competing therapy or a related therapy. And things may have changed considerably in the 10 to 12 years that it took to develop that particular product. You really want to be in the position of driving your own company through the FDA, and you have to really do that in a way that you're well informed. So in other words, what I'm sharing with you some of the things I've seen in the 5 years that I've been, practicing back in Wisconsin. And I do see, way too much reliance on and not taking what I'm really saying is I'm not taking the regulatory ball and working with it yourself, but rather getting advice from other people that may not be directly related to the product you're trying to develop.
Okay. Another question for me is when somebody sits down with you at the beginning for a consultation, what kinds of things do what does that look like? What kinds of things do you go over? What kinds of things do you ask at the beginning?
Well, generally, these at this level, the excuse me, the SBIR, STTR types, they have a piece of research that they, believe is, very strongly in and that they would like to commercialize. But they will generally say, the big market is, for example, some disease that has millions and millions of people. And what their goal is, or what they think the path is going to be, is to take the product, develop it a little bit, be acquired by a big company, and then leave all the regulatory planning and processing to that big company. Which this is a contributing factor, I think, to the valley of death. I don't think companies will take a product where there isn't, a clear-cut regulatory path. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that most of the people that are filing for SBIR, STTR don't have regulatory experience in developing the product. They have medical experience, they have scientific experience, they may have commercial experience, and investment experience. But for the most part, regulatory is always left out. But that's, in a way, the thing that's most important in terms of getting the product, on the market. And so having, if they don't have any experience in any of these larger markets, I say, think of it this way. If you need the protocol assistance and you need, to be able to write off the R&D expenses, and you need, some kind of commercial entree that to a market that doesn't have a lot of additional, players. Think about a rare disease indication, because most of the pathways for the research that goes on, particularly for drugs, to some extent, medical devices, but that's a little bit different. You've got choices about how to pursue something. You can pursue a more narrow indication that provides a lot of benefits, or you can pursue a really big non-rare indication that looks as though initially it would be better for your company, because after all, it's bigger, and so therefore that you can sell more of this drug later on. In reality, that's not the case. The things that I think are most important to companies are to get the support they need through the development process, which comes only with a smaller indication. You can always go for the bigger indication later, but the problem is if you decide to pursue the bigger indication and say, those are bigger problems, and say you as a company, you surmount all of that and you get the product on the market. There's, if you go back for the rare disease indication, you don't get the benefits of any of that, because you've already hit the market and you're approved as a non-orphan indication. The other thing is that often if you pursue a smaller indication, a larger company will see the value of that in the bigger indication and say, all right, we're more likely to acquire this. We will continue the work in the rare disease indication because we want all these benefits that accrue to it. But our real goal here is to do something in a larger indication. I've seen that model pursued many times.
I have one more question. More question.
Go ahead.
So you mentioned at the end that building in a regulatory affairs function at the start is a good defense for a early stage, startup company. Do you have a sense of how much time in the early days of, how much of a person's time is the right amount of time, or how much is too little, what people should expect when they're getting started to be focusing the right amount of attention on this?
I think you really need to discuss early on what your goals are for the product. And that means, start from the back end of it or the front end of it and say, all right, I want to approve, market a drug or a device that does this. And these are the claims I want to make on my label. And then, work backwards and say, all right, if I were to do that, what kinds of regulatory mechanisms would benefit this project and this company, and how will I, utilize those? And then think about if you didn't get everything you wanted on the label. If, for example, there are questions, there are always scientific questions about things, but say, model the label a little bit and try and get and play with it and see, well, if I could get approval for this disease, I could make these claims. This is all way before you actually have the supportive data to be able to prove safety and efficacy. But, you need to think about what this process is going to look like at the end and be aware of multiple scenarios. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I was just thinking, was about being intentional about the amount of focus that someone is delegated to have in an early stage when they're so strapped for time and that type of thing. So I think it helps.
Yeah.
Any questions from anyone else before we close up here? Okay. Oh,
Okay.
Anne Marie, thank you very much for
Thank you.
joining us, and it's very informative. And that ends our 3-session afternoon, and thanks everybody for joining us. And I will be sharing sharing recordings in the near future. Thanks a lot.